Slow down. You're going too fast. If you want to take better pictures, you just got to slow down. Hey, thanks for joining me. You know, in our world today, we live in such a fast-paced world where everything happens very quickly and there's a lot of pressure to get things done. And we have this, we've gotten in this habit of expecting instant gratification from everything, and everything has to happen real fast. And I think more and more people are looking for ways to slow down in their lives to increase or improve the quality of their life. And that applies to photography too. And I think that there's a lot of benefits to just slowing down, using a more methodical approach to your photography, and you end up having more fun, having a better time taking pictures, and you end up with better pictures. So this morning I have 6 tips that will help you slow down, take a more methodical approach, and end up with some really nice pictures. So let's talk about this. There's like I say, 6 tips. I think you'll find them pretty straightforward, and hopefully they'll be helpful for you. So tip number 1, in the words of Matt Marash, who is a large format photographer and YouTube creator, get a frickin' tripod. So Matt Marash has a YouTube channel where he talks about large format photography. I really love his channel, and he even has a t-shirt that says this, get a frickin' tripod. And this started for him with not actually large format, but when he was learning digital photography, his professor or instructor he had in college was famous for saying that, evidently. Anyway, tripods. Now, if you know me, I love vintage cameras. I also love vintage tripods. But you can get new ones, you can get old ones. I mean, I have both. I have tabletop tripods. I have, this is kind of a lightweight tripod. I have some great big heavy ones for my large format cameras, all different kinds. Modern tripods have some really neat conveniences, and some of them are pretty affordable. This is one from Came TV. That's a tabletop tripod. I use this for like my pinhole cameras and some of those kind of things. But even for the Micro Four Thirds, if I want my camera real close to the ground. This is actually an old Gitzo Traveler. I bought this at a thrift store for like $13. And I typically, on these kind of tripods, I'll add the Arca Swiss type quick, remove plate, and that way I can quickly change, the camera, take it on and off. But I love old vintage tripods, especially the good quality ones, tripods by Gitzo and Manfrotto or Bogan. There's some others that are just really excellent tripods. One of my favorites is I have a Lights Tilt-All that just a beautifully made. Of course, anything from Lights is pretty nice. But Lights Tilt-All, it's a great tripod. But there's more benefits to using a tripod than just holding your camera steady. Clearly, there's probably no better way to keep your camera steady and level than using a tripod. But there's other benefits, and we're going to talk about those in some of the following steps. But first step, get a good quality tripod. And I've been thinking about creating a video on how to use tripods, how to get the best use out of them, how to create the most stable setup with them. And if you think that might be of interest to you, leave me a comment. I'd like to hear if that's something there's some interest in doing. But get a good quality tripod so that you can hold that camera steady. And you can keep it in a fixed position long enough to do step number 2. And step number 2 is compose like you're shooting a large format camera. Large format cameras, obviously, this is a really old one. Large format cameras kind of force you to slow down. You really just can't do things super fast with a large format camera, right? So the people that shoot large format will understand this right away. When you shoot large format, and I think that if you compose your pictures like you're shooting large format, you're going to do some things that you don't normally do. With a large format camera, your image, first of all, and you can't really see it, it's too gray today to have a bright enough image to see anything, but your image is actually upside down and backwards on the ground glass. So it makes it a little interesting to look at and be able to compose, because everything's, it's upside down, it's backwards. So you have to study it pretty carefully. You have to look and see, where everything is in the image, what's at the edges of the frame, have you got things centered properly? And you also want to look for things, and this really applies to any camera, but you're taking a three-dimensional world and you're turning it into a two-dimensional image. And so it's real easy to put something in front of something else. Where you've heard of the proverbial tree growing out of someone's head. Those kind of things where you have two objects in the image, one in front of the other, and they conflict. They might make something that looks really weird, like a tree growing out of someone's head, or they might just make something that just makes you kind of look at that spot in the image twice, and it distracts from the overall image because you're trying to figure out what is this thing over here in this picture. I was watching a video from another large format photographer, and he was talking about how, he sometimes would just move his tripod a few inches one way or the other because there might be a light pole that's lined up with a corner of a building or something that made the building look weird. He does architectural photography. And so, studying the image, looking for the small details, making sure the camera's level, making sure that it's, you're not tilting it up or down and converging or spreading your verticals, that you've got things centered the way you want, that there's no conflicts in the image. Compose like you're shooting a large format camera. And this works both well with cameras that have viewfinders as well as cameras that just have screens. It's a great way to use a camera with a screen because you can kind of treat it like it was a view camera, and you can kind of study the image. And you can do that through a viewfinder too. But this works equally well with both types of cameras. So compose your images, even though it's a digital camera, like you're shooting large format. Okay, tip number 3, manually focus your image where you want it to be. Now, if you've done much study of photography, you've heard of hyperfocal distances, and the way this works basically is when you stop a lens down to a smaller aperture, you get more depth of field, which means that there's more area in front of and behind where you focus that appear in focus also. And they're not as perfectly sharp in focus as the focus plane, but they're acceptably sharp. And with Micro Four Thirds, of course, you get a lot more depth of field. That's one of the nice things about it. But the kind of the rule of thumb with this hyperfocal distance or this depth of field is that when you focus on something and you're stopped down small enough to have some depth of field, that depth of field will cover an area that's about 1/3 in front of the plane of focus and 2/3 behind. So you get more distance behind. So if you're shooting landscapes, you don't necessarily want to focus all the way at infinity at, what's the farthest thing, because if you want some things in the foreground to be in focus, you have to choose a spot closer up that you can focus on that gives you enough sharp area in the foreground and good sharpness in the background, covers the whole thing. So this is a time where manual focus lenses and vintage lenses really work well because you can manually focus them easily. I mean, some cameras you can most autofocus lenses do have a manual focus ring. Some don't, but a lot of them do. And you can switch the camera to manual focus, and you can use focus aids, and you can focus. And so you can do it really with most any lens, but this is a time when vintage lenses or manual focus lenses don't have a disadvantage. So again, kind of like a large format photographer, you're going to study that screen. You're going to focus carefully to make sure that you've got acceptable sharpness in your foreground and your background, wherever you need it to be. And so that's tip number 3. Manually focus, intentionally focus your image so that you're getting the maximum coverage of sharpness, foreground to background. Okay, tip number 4 is very purposefully choose your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. That doesn't mean you have to shoot manual. I still shoot aperture priority, but if I'm wanting a really clean image with no noise, then I'm going to choose a very low ISO. But today is kind of misty and gray. I probably should be out taking pictures of something other than shooting a video, but it's a great time to crank up the ISO a little bit and create some images that have that grainy kind of film look, have that character. So this is not always going to be the lowest ISO. Sometimes it might be higher. So you want to think about these things. Choose your ISO carefully. Choose your aperture. Again, if you need lots of depth of field, then you want a small aperture. Keeping in mind, especially with micro four thirds, if you stop down too much, then you become diffraction limited. So you kind of have to think about where you want to be. If you're wanting an image that has very little depth of field, you want to have a very delineated plane of focus and things in front of it and behind it, out of focus and soft and have that nice creamy background, then you're going to choose a large aperture. And, for most of the time when you're doing this kind of photography, you're not photographing moving subjects. There's going to be landscapes, architecture, cityscapes, still lifes, things like that. And so you have the convenience of time to make these selections. And most cameras these days have a depth of field preview even. And with a manual lens, of course, you always have depth of field preview. But even with your modern lenses, like this camera has a depth of field preview button, I can actually make the lens stop down and I can see, what the difference is going to be in terms of my background. So very purposefully choose these settings. And this is a great time also, of course, to not only, obviously you can set the exposure where the camera is saying to, but it's a great time to say, do I need to compensate? Do I need to, add some exposure, subtract some exposure? Is it too light? Is it too dark? What can I change here? Do I want to change my color temperature? Does this look too warm? Does it look too cool? If you run a camera primarily on auto white balance, it might be a time you want to force it into a different white balance or experiment with it. Or maybe if you're just trying to create a warmer look or a cooler look, depending on your subject, you might want to choose a different white balance. So this is a time when you want to look at those settings and examine what you're going to get, in terms of your picture. So very purposefully choose your ISO, aperture, shutter speed, white balance, all those settings so that you get just the kind of image quality you want. Tip number 5 is follow a process. One of the things that I'm going to go back to Matt Marash and his channel, when he does large format photography, he has a thing called doing the dance, where the dance being this process that he has developed for each step in the process of taking a picture with he shoots 8x10 cameras, great big things. So he has this process that he goes through, and he always does the same things in the same order as a process. And I think that's important to do even when you're shooting digital. Have a process where you set the camera up, you get your composition set, you start looking at focus, you look at exposure, each of these steps, whatever the process is for you, you develop this process. Probably doesn't hurt in the beginning to maybe write the process down so you can kind of have a checklist and follow it. After you've done it a while, it'll become automatic. But create a process and follow that process. Do it every time, and that way your images will be consistent and you will have not skipped a step or missed something that's important to you. Now, I'm listing 6 steps. You might come up with some others you want to put in here. But whatever the process is for you, make sure that each time you take pictures, you're following that process. Whatever the dance is for you, follow it. Do it every time. Make it a habit. You have to do something quite a few times to make it a habit. So, like I said, it doesn't hurt to write it down. Follow that checklist. You can do it in your phone with a note in your phone or whatever. But do that process the same way each time for a while. And then once you kind of get it kind of in your head, then you'll have it. Now keep in mind that this process can vary depending on the type of camera you're using. So if one day you go out with a digital camera and you're trying to do this slow down thing, and the next day you go out with a film camera, the process is different. So, and just keep that in mind that you might need more than one process depending on the type of equipment you're using. So, create a process, follow that process every time. The other thing that this does is it makes the whole thing more enjoyable. It eases the tension. You don't have this nervousness of, did I forget to do something? Do I have everything here? Of course, with digital, the nice thing is you take the picture and you'll see the results. If you miss something, you'll probably see it. But even with digital, the screens aren't big enough for you to really critically examine the image. And so if you missed your focus a little bit or something, you probably might not be able to tell it. So create a process, follow that process. Tip number 6 And I think this one's really important, and I think, again, in this digital age, we tend to forget to do this, is take notes. Now, the cool thing with digital is you have your EXIF data on your images, so you don't have to write down the shutter speed, aperture, or whatever. But there may be times when there's other information you want to record about where you were, what the lighting conditions were like, other things that affect the image, and you can't put that in EXIF data. So you can use, in your phone, you can use a note app, or you can take a notebook with you. I often have just a paper, I don't have it with me today, but I have it's in my large format bag, I have a notepad and a pencil, and I take notes about each image. Each picture I take, I'll write some notes down about it. And it may be very brief. And some people just do voice notes, they just create a voice note and say, this is the exposure, blah, 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 and I'm at such and such place, and, whatever. You can do that too, and then you can transcribe that stuff later if you need to. But whatever you do, again, record what you're doing. Take notes, make note of it, because at some point you're going to want to go back and say, this picture looks really good. I love the way this turned out. What did I do to make this picture look so good? And there might be some things in there like, compensating your exposure, changing the white balance because the lighting was, like today, it's very gray out, so the light's going to be a little bit cool. Maybe if you wanted to warm it up, whatever. But there's some things that don't end up in EXIF data that's really helpful if you go ahead and have some notes. So anyway, that's the 6 steps. Not real complicated. Get a tripod. Matt Marash would say, get a frickin' tripod. And and if you've watched my videos, I've referred to this more than once. Really important. I love using tripods. That's why I have so many of them. I have this thing about vintage tripods, and I don't have as many of them as I have vintage cameras, but I have a growing collection of vintage tripods, some really cool ones too. Compose like you're shooting large format. This is a big part of the slow down thing. Slow down, study your image, get the composition right, make sure there's no conflicts, make sure everything's arranged the way you want. Take the time to do that. I think, again, we get in this rush and we tend to just pull up a camera and snap a picture, and then later on we go, oh, there's this thing. I wish I hadn't done that. You don't have time if you're just snapping away like that. So take the time to compose carefully and get your picture. And then tip number 3, manually focus the camera. Make sure that you've got foreground, background, subject all in focus with enough depth of field or no depth of field and only the plane of focus where you want your subject. However you're doing it, make sure you have that focus set exactly like you want. Do that very carefully. Number 4, very purposefully choose your ISO, aperture, shutter speed, white balance, all those settings to make sure you have the image looking as close to what you want as possible. This eliminates, or not eliminate, but maybe reduces post-processing work. So that's always helpful. Number 5, follow a process, create a process, document it, use it, write it down, follow that process every time, and that makes the whole thing just easier and less stressful. And number 6, take notes. Make a record of what you've done. Maybe someday when I'm getting to be pretty old, I'm 65, someday I'm going to pass away. My kids, grandkids might enjoy reading through some of those notes about things I'd written about when I was taking pictures. I don't know. It'll be something I would love to have those kind of notes if my dad had done that. So take notes. It's always good to have that information. Well, I hope you found some of this helpful. And, if you have any thoughts or questions, I hope you'll leave me a comment. If you have some steps in there that you think I've left out that you think should be added, I'd love it if you'd share those with us, because I'm not saying this is an all-inclusive list, but I think there's some good tips. So if you have some ideas, please share those with us. And as always, hey, thanks for watching.